Hi, everybody. This is Bob Schwartz from ASIP, and I am doing an audio interview, a telephone interview with David Whyte, who will be presenting at the conference. David, how are you today?
Very good, thank you. In the rainy Northwest here.
I have a few questions for you. David's doing a keynote address and a pre-conference seminar, and one of the questions I have for you has to do with questions, which is you raised the issue of asking a beautiful question. So my question is, what are the qualities of a beautiful question? And are those qualities actually in the question, or are they in the person asking the question? How can we bring this into a therapy or coaching space?
Yes. Well, I inherited the question about the beautiful question, in a sense, from a colleague and friend of mine, John O'Donoghue, who wrote extensively on his inherited theology, both in mystic Catholicism and from the Irish tradition. And after he passed away, I inherited a workshop of his, which people asked me to come and lead because everything was in place except John. And the workshop was on creating a beautiful mind. And I thought it was a really wonderful title, actually, because he really was looking at the way a human being can actually practice having a more beautiful mind, just as you can practice the violin or the piano or dancing. And as I brought my own thoughts to bear on it to make it my own, I realized I asked myself, well, how do you practice having a more beautiful mind? And I realized quite quickly that it had to do with the ability to ask beautiful questions and to practice the asking of beautiful questions on a daily basis. And I might say actually that a beautiful question is usually quite a disturbing question at the same time, because it slightly subverts the identity of the person who is asking the question in the first place, partly because one of the diagnostics of a beautiful question is that it always enlarges the context in which you're living. It broadens the horizon and deepens the horizon and takes you out of yourself and into yourself at the same time. And when I talk about horizon in a human life, I think of the horizon outside of us, the goals we set ourselves in our outer life. But in all of our great contemplative traditions, there's been an understanding of this inner horizon, this level, which is this deep level, foundational level inside a human being, which is also a kind of symmetrical journey to this outside journey, and deepening that horizon is part of the ability to ask these beautiful questions. And I often think that a beautiful question shapes your identity as much by asking it as by having it answered, and that's one of my personal definitions of a beautiful question. It deepens your sense of yourself. So there was an Elizabethan, actually Jacobean Christian mystic poet called Henry Vaughan in England in the 1600s, and he wrote a very famous line about this interior horizon, in a way, and called it a deep but dazzling darkness. And it's deep because it's foundational, but it's dazzling because it reflects your own persona in a way that actually makes it difficult to get below the surface. Yeah. So part of asking the beautiful question is letting go of a smaller identity that might ask the question in the wrong way, and allow the world to speak back to you in its own terms, in a way. So the beautiful question is the one that, in a way, asks the question. It's asking the question from the other side of the boundary that you've refused to cross. It's enlarging your language. Wittgenstein, the great philosopher, said you can't enter any territory for which you have not learned the language. So part of asking the beautiful question is giving up your small language, your mechanistic language, the language by which the strategic part of your mind is constantly trying to keep things under control, and start to have a language that actually appears out of more of a frontier identity, the place where you and the horizon start to become one. And this place, of course, especially in the interior foundation, is the place where from which we write poetry. And it's why poetry is so powerful, I think, as a lens for psychologists of any stripe, because it's really poetry is the discipline of poetry is the discipline of overhearing yourself say things you didn't know you knew about your world. The deeper imagination had already, the deeper part of you actually was already living in this place at the center of the pattern. He just hasn't learned how to speak yet. And you could say that poetry is the practice of speaking and asking these beautiful questions from this deep interior, which you're just learning to live in.
Or maybe
and
just
noticing.
Just noticing what it's there, right? Because they sort of show up, and then you have to catch them as they go by before they disappear.
Well, it's more, I see it rather than going by, but as this place of origin.
Okay.
One of the difficult phenomena of poetry, which is familiar to all writers, everyone who's ever tried to write good poetry. It's very easy to write bad poetry, but to write good poetry, you find that you have to go to a deep part of the physical body or the psyche that has hardly spoken yet. And so, strangely enough, the part of you which you're trying to train into this beautiful form of articulation and questioning has no vocabulary as yet. Yeah. Your strategic surface mind has all the vocabulary and all the excuses as to why you shouldn't go down into this phase. So there's this very strange inversion, this very strange irony, this very strange kind of unilateral disarmament of giving up your surface language in order to enter what one great Christian mystic called the cloud of unknowing. And this unknowing is the other side of the veil that you haven't crossed yet. It's a larger emancipation of your identity. It's the next step, and you're in a sense allowing that part of you to speak and to ask these beautiful questions and to invite you over to join us at the same time. And in many ways, it's a more mature part than the part of you that walks around every day. But the more time we spend with the blank page or the laptop screen, however the poet writes today, or whether you're a poet or not, just with the attempt to articulate from this unknown place, the more you start to actually build a vocabulary and a language.
As I'm hearing you talk, as my mind goes to many places as usual, but I'm wondering, so a beautiful question, I imagine there are sort of levels, if you will, as a beginner, and beautiful. There's a beginning level beautiful question, and a medium, and a more advanced. For the people listening, is there, part of me wants to go, what are the top 10 beautiful questions, David Whyte? Please answer now. But I don't think that's going to happen.
No.
I didn't think so.
Yeah.
But
partly because the beautiful question is your question. I mean, I think one of the difficulties of modern and postmodern psychology is the way we learn, one learns this particular language that gets you through all the examinations and your certification. And it too often gets projected on the person who sat with you, in the therapist's office. And the beautiful question is your question. The place, both the question that you carry just because of the way you're made, your life is a question that is being asked in the way no one else's life is being no one else's question is being asked. And then you've also got the particular threshold of maturity or immaturity that you're on at the moment, you know, whether you're an adolescent or in your 20s or in your 50s or in your 70s. That each epoch in our life has a beautiful question attached to it. And part of, you know, to shift to the analogy of the pilgrim, part of the pilgrim journey through life, part of the necessity of the pilgrim is to learn another language. And so I think the therapist has to learn the particular lineaments of the language that the person uses, that they're working with, that is their own language.
So,
and represents their questions. So the person in the office is not just living in the gravitational field of the therapist's inherited academic or trained language. Does that make sense?
It does. And what I'm hearing, like a lot of times with clients, it's like I want to listen, like they're living like their mother's or their father's or somebody else's language. And part of my job is to listen for the beginnings or the nascent aspects of their own language that they don't even recognize.
Exactly. That's lovely. Yeah.
And so, and you, it's not like you can go, there it is exactly, but you sort of feel it. You have to sort of, your eyeballs peeled for it, or you sense it in your body. Something changes, something in your eye, you perk up, you go, what was that?
Yes.
Or something like that. Yes.
And there's a wonderful corollary. There's a kind of inversion around what is not yet being said yet. So you can have one beautiful question of someone is what is the question you're refusing to ask? You could say, what is the beautiful question you're refusing to ask? But what is the question you're refusing to ask? And this has a gorgeous kind of gravitational pull to it. And perhaps the person should be disallowed from answering it right away. You might need a week to go away and ask yourself. I can think of I have a line in a poem that says,
please,
the other side, which actually describes this, looking down into a holy well in the west of Ireland, you know, and it's a question from it's something speaking from the other side of the question you have refused to ask, and looking down into the reflection of the well, the other side of the question you've refused to ask. And I can think of a kind of elementary, hilarious representation of this, in that a good friend of mine was in the therapist's office with her therapist, and the therapist said to her, "Now, how are you with criticism?" And my friend immediately said, "Oh, I'm great with criticism. Whenever I see anyone doing anything I don't like, I tell them right away," which of course was not what the therapist was asking. And in fact, she caught herself and knew, you know, she was busted halfway through the sentence. So almost always we're asking the question in a way that's quite protective and self-justifying. So just the ability to actually look back at ourselves, which all of our great traditions say is happening all the time anyway. The world is looking back at you. I have a piece called "Everything is Waiting for You," about the way we're standing at the middle of this extraordinary creation, many elements of which are allies, and yet we're not in a real conversation. We're not in a real conversation with the color blue in the sky or green, especially the way we've retreated into our tiny screens, away from the outer horizon, which also calls us, just like this internal horizon calls us. And there's a lot of the way that we're caught in this limbo land, especially the internet's become an astonishing excuse for this neutral zone where other people's arguments, other people's questions, other people's images are imprisoning us, you know, in a kind of insulated protectiveness, where we don't have to ask those questions ourselves.
So so part of my brain wants to see if I can get you came up with one really great question that now I can't even repeat about what's the question that you don't dare ask of yourself, which is a wonderful. I wonder if you have one or two others that folks can begin to model off of in that vein, that they can kind of play with before they come to the conference and hear more.
Yes.
Anything come to mind?
Yes. Well, yes, I have another one coming out of a piece I wrote called Sometimes. And the poem goes like this. It says, sometimes, and it takes this image in a child's book I had of Native American teaching stories. And it's an elder teaching a child how to cross a piece of broken ground without making a sound, which is a classic, enticing story that most children come across at one time or another and then try themselves out in the woods, you know. And I was no exception. And many years later, I wrote this piece looking back at why that practice of crossing a broken ground without making a sound is so compelling for a human being. So this is called Sometimes. Sometimes, if you move carefully through the forest, sometimes, if you move carefully through the forest, breathing like the ones in the old stories. Sometimes, if you move carefully through the forest, breathing like the ones in the old stories who could cross a shimmering bed of leaves without a sound, you come to a place whose only task is to trouble you with tiny but frightening requests, conceived out of nowhere, but in this place beginning to lead everywhere. Requests to stop what you are doing right now and to stop what you are becoming while you do it. Questions that can make or unmake a life. Questions that have patiently waited for you. Questions that have no right to go away. Questions that have no right to go away. So that was a beautiful arrangement at the end, because there's always a beautiful question in individual life. What is the question that has no right to go away in my life right now? I can turn my face away from it, but when I turn it back, it's still there. In fact, when I turn my face away, my life goes into neutral. And this is true for a relationship too. Every marriage or relationship has a question that has no right to go away. And the maturation and emancipation of the relationship depends on that question being addressed. And not necessarily solved, which is a lovely relief, but just as we know, just the act of a couple turning their faces back to this central question makes the relationship more real again.
Well put.
Yeah, it creates that outer horizon which every relationship needs. When the future horizon dies in a relationship, the present dies also. And so the ability to actually turn our eyes in a relationship together towards a shared horizon is absolutely necessary. And it's literally why a good holiday for a couple is so nourishing, because often it's out in the natural world, or it's by the ocean, where there's this other horizon. It's a kind of unconscious understanding that we need to drop our everyday busyness and get back to something that was very precious, that we shared at the beginning. That's beyond us both. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That's great. Well, I'm sure if people don't know your work and they heard this, they're going to be enticed to come. And those that know your work will have been pleased. And I want to thank you so much for your time. I look forward to seeing you in San Antonio.
I look forward to that very much, and to the crowd that you're bringing together there. So, yes.
All right.
We'll try and ask some of those beautiful questions together.
Some of those, and we'll go on a pilgrim's path, and it'll all be good. So people can get a nice dose of this. All right. Well, thank you so much.
Lovely.
Take care. All right.
Thank you very much. Yes.